So without any further ado, please welcome Matt Mullenweg.
So I'm going to talk about the moral philosophy of performance in mature web applications, just so I still fit the title in there. Basically, I think that a lot of what we do is going to talk about what we do, which I'll talk about a little bit, but there's not as much of a why. A little bit of background. My name is Matt Mullenweg. These are all the many, many ways to contact me. If you have any questions or if you would like any links or anything about my presentation, please feel free to contact me. I am probably best known because 6 years ago I co-founded something called WordPress. About 4 years ago I left my job at CNET and started working on Automattic, which now runs at Kismet, WordPress.com, and Gravatar, which collectively serve up many billions of requests per day. Along the way, we've learned a number of things, which I'm calling parables of performance, because these are basically just stories we've come across along the way. Well, things we've learned phrased as stories that we've run into, sometimes on things we're running, and sometimes just random WordPresses around the world on random hosts. First thing I want to talk about is my favorite, the favicon. For those of you who don't know, who doesn't know what a favicon actually is? Oh, okay. A favicon is one of those little itty-bitty icons that's up sort of by the address bar in your browser. Often, so if you visit a WordPress.com site, it's a little W that looks like the icon I had on there. If you visit my site, it's actually the WordPress logo upside down, so it makes an M for Matt. A little Easter egg there. So we got contacted by a higher profile WordPress site. I believe they were hosting on either like a DreamHost or a Media Temple. The traffic was really starting to tick up. They were talking about politics, and this was the lead up to the elections last November. And what they were finding was that the site was just getting killed, and caching and everything was not helping. And it almost seemed like there was outsized with the number of page views, there was something that was going on behind the scenes that was just killing the server. Now, when you went to the site, it actually didn't seem that much slower, as long as there was nothing really obvious that was slowing the site down in terms of front-end performance. But on the back end, it was definitely hurting. We started digging in, and eventually, basically, we were looking at server configuration stuff, installing WP Super Cache, installing, some sort of caching, looking at the headers things are doing. And eventually, as I started to dig in more, I brought out my favorite tool, Firebug, which I'm sure everyone here knows and loves, and noticed that there was a 404 error going to the favicon. This site did not have a favicon. Now, why does this matter? Well, WordPress is very greedy. By default, it has an HT access, which grabs every single URL, including 404s. So what was happening was, for every single page that was being loaded, the browser was requesting the favicon, and it was getting a 404, which was basically a WordPress database-generated page, which has much more overhead than a normal 404. What was that? Oh, I thought someone said something. If you do want to holler, I can't see anything. This light's very bright, so you can just shout out. Now, so we just kind of went in. So basically, for every page he was doing another one. On the browser side, there was no perceptible slowdown because, as far as I know, favicons are not blocking in any major browser. Steve can correct me if I'm wrong there, but so there was no sort of perceptible thing. But on the back end, it was really hurting. So, simple fix: we just put a favicon in there, and boom. Basically, they got 2x improvement in the number of things they're able to do. So 100% improvement for maybe like 5 bytes of icon. I thought that was a pretty cool one. And what this illustrated to me was, well, one, what's the moral philosophy of this? It didn't matter to users at all. But on the server side, we were able to alleviate a lot of load with something that no one had ever noticed or should even really matter. I mean, it's kind of like a weird combination of things that WordPress does, things that everything, to kind of a perfect storm of messiness. Next up is the WordPress script loader. Who here uses WordPress? Let's see. Okay, so we got a fairly smart audience. I'm kidding. Around a long time ago, we started getting, the magic of WordPress is really not so much in the core software, whose features could be duplicated pretty easily by anyone working for a couple months. But in the wide array of plugins and themes available for it, there are literally probably about 10,000 plugins and themes available for WordPress. And one of the reasons people use it, well, what I like to say is that there's no more killer features in software anymore. There's 1,000 killer features, and every person in this room has a different 20. We can do another survey. Who here runs Firefox? Raise your hand. Okay. Who here runs Firefox with no extensions? Exactly. We had one person. That's actually, you're the first person I know that runs Firefox with no extensions. It's where the really fun stuff is. Now, the danger of this is that plugins, it's very easy to code a plugin for WordPress. That is the danger. It means anyone and everyone does it. And one of the problems we had to tackle about 2 years ago was that, let's say a plugin needed jQuery. It would start just how it worked before was they would just hook into the header, the head of the page, and insert their script. And you get a point where sometimes pages were loading like 3 or 4 identical copies of jQueries at different URLs. So we created something called a script loader. Basically, the idea was that basically there's a function called WP enqueue script, and if you want jQuery, you say, hey, give me jQuery, and it sort of, after it's done processing the page, it says, okay, let's put a jQuery in, here are the dependencies, here's everything that we need for these various scripts, and it all just kind of magically works. Now, this was before Steve's second book, so we still were not fully enlightened. We were putting everything in the head. We had a big head. And of course, as we learned, that's not needed. About 95% of our stuff really didn't need to be in the head. It could go in the foot of the page. So around 2.8, which was our most recent release, actually reached 1 million downloads yesterday. I was very happy about that. We started basically changing how all the script loader logic works and putting as much as possible, as late as possible in the page. Of course, so that the browser seems to be more responsive. This had a huge impact. Well, one, we ended up breaking a little bit of backwards compatibility of plugins, which is always a bummer. But from a user point of view, we actually shaved a couple of seconds off of our write page, which I was thrilled about because I thought, wow, this is going to have a big impact. So literally, the day after we brought this on WordPress.com. WordPress.com is kind of our test bed. For those who don't know, there's 2 flavors of WordPress. There's WordPress.org, which is the sort of self-hosted, you download it, you install it on your server, you have complete control over it. You can do whatever you want to it. But because it's so distributed, we have very little insight into how people are using it. And then over here we have WordPress.com, which is about 6 or 7 million blogs now, and we host all of them. So we track at a very fine-grained level, probably 500 or 600 different statistics about everything going on, how people are using it, how many categories they're using per post. We can make interface changes and then sort of track, see if anything happened. To be honest, all those stats we track are usually not very actionable. So I was hoping that when we made this performance change, that's literally shaving seconds off a crucial page, probably the most crucial page in all of WordPress, that we'd see one of these numbers change. And it was actually completely remarkable. In this field, it's good to have stories where even small performance changes can have big improvements on user usage. This, however, was not one of them. There was actually no change at all in how anyone was using WordPress, how anyone was blogging anything. Like the number of posts the growth curve did not change one iota. I was heartbroken. We had just spent so much time, basically like a month and a half, making all these changes, and we had an objectively better way of doing things that was measurably faster. We followed all the rules. So the point of parable number 2 is that sometimes it doesn't matter. I think that what basically happened, if I go back and look at it, is that by the time you got to the WordPress write page, you were going to write a post. If it took 2 seconds to load or if it took 5 seconds to load, you didn't change your mind about writing a post in those 3 seconds. I mean, it's not Twitter, so things are generally a little bit longer. So if you have something, and conversely, the other side of that is if you have something that people really want to do, incremental optimizations probably aren't going to have a huge effect on the usage. Now, I would have loved to have been wrong in this situation. Maybe we didn't isolate the variables enough, or maybe there was something that was wrong, or there's any number of things where this could have been, and probably was, a horrible experiment. But I think that it was worth doing anyway. A third parable, saying no. This is actually one of my favorite quotes. It goes from Joe Clark, who is a noted standardista up in Canada. He says, "We've upped our standards, up yours." He coined this at the beginning of the adoption of web standards. The days when we all started taking the tables out of our house and using CSS. No more pixel spacer GIFs and all. Does anyone even remember that? I feel so old when I talk about this stuff. No, it's like, yeah, we really used to do that. We really used to take a single pixel GIF and change the size. I can't even imagine, that's going to be like our walking uphill in the snow story 20 years from now. So the beginning of the adoption of web standards, and we were sort of at a point where the techniques and the support in browsers was not yet to the point, or perhaps just the creativity of the designers using CSS was not to the point where CSS designs honestly looked as good as their table and spatial GIF equivalents. And there was no technical well, there might have been browser support or something like that, but there was really no strong reason why they should be different. It was mostly a matter of people's mental model. When I do designs, for example, I usually do it on a pen and paper first, because I find that any amount, if I'm in Photoshop or if I'm in Illustrator or anything like that, even if I'm very familiar with those programs, the mental model, like having to adapt my mind to the software, inhibits your creativity and inhibits your ideas. And you end up having ideas that are easy for you to do in whichever medium you're using. So obviously, to be as creative as possible, you should try to remove all the barriers as possible. So people were designing in CSS, which means that they were doing things that were easy in CSS, which was creating blocky layouts, things that looked sort of like the original, box layouts. This is layers, and here's where you put them in divs and everything like that, from way, way, way back in the day. Now, those of you who have used WordPress for a while know that we have somewhat of an infatuation with rounded corners, and always have. In fact, I'm proud to say that our Kubrick template, introduced in 1.5 4.5 years ago, was, as far as I know, the first major CMS template or anything like that to have rounded corners, which was very avant-garde at the time, if you can believe it. We recently did a redesign, a big redesign for WordPress, version 2.7. We sort of went back to the very beginning, all the assumptions we've made throughout all the years of doing WordPress, and saw that a lot of things we were doing were just because we had done them before. And since I was there when we had done them before, I knew that there was no logical reason for it. There was sort of an inclination to say, oh, we've done that for 4 years now. We should keep doing it. But since I was there 4 years ago, I knew that I just pulled that out of my butt. There was no reason why we did it that way. So we went to the very core of it, ripped apart the software, did crazy things like moved navigation from the top to the left, and it was total chaos in the WordPress world. But this redesign actually did have a measurable impact in sort of people's adoption of it. It was around the last, let's call it the last month and a half before 2.7 was being released, and we were sort of polishing the design. When we initially introduced all sort of the usability and interaction changes, we had deliberately made it really ugly. So people wouldn't, focus on the aesthetics of it. They would sort of focus on what was going on under the hood. It kind of looked like a bunch of wireframes. So as we started to put sort of an aesthetic layer on top of it, I became really excited because it actually started to become kind of sexy. And open source, I usually don't associate open source software with, lickability. And it was starting to get that elements of lickableness. I suppose that's a word. So we're a month and a half out, and I don't know what came over me that day, but I opened up Internet Explorer. And I visited our extremely lickable interface and had a mild coronary. I was shocked. Actually, not because it looked that bad. It wasn't sort of the classic horror story of things were all flying around the page, and you click a button and, a baby seal dies or something like Internet Explorer usually does. It was really quite minor. Everything, because the guys doing this had been testing everything in IE. I mean, everything looked pretty much the same, except those beautiful rounded corners, which I have now had a 4-year love affair with. longest relationship I've had actually, were gone. We were using the Moz border radius property, sort of an extension of CSS, not yet a full standard, to round all the corners of everything. And it looked great in Safari. We were doing it so it looked great. And we're using border radius as well. It looked good in Safari, it looked great in Firefox, but in IE, you got this very blocky experience. And I was like, no one will ever use this. This completely ruins 100% of the aesthetics where, we can't do this. And of course, to get rounded corners in IE, then you have to jump through some hoops, right? You now have like 7 layers of divs, and you put like a top left background in one and a top right background in the other. And then you need to use the sliding doors technique to make sure if it gets wider or shorter, it doesn't really matter. It's a flexible width. You have to, it's really frightening the amount of extra work and markup and images and everything you have to do to make this work well. So we had sort of a long discussion about this. And my initial, as sort of the project leader, my initial reactions were to, we just got to do this. We have to have a parity of experience, of aesthetics at least, and how it works on both systems. But I was gradually worn down. And even though people say I'm the leader of WordPress, I often say I'm led by WordPress. The community sort of said, well, we don't really care about IE, which makes sense because on WordPress.org, we have something like 75% Firefox usage. It's ridiculous how few IE users there are on the WordPress.org side. And on WordPress.com, it's the complete opposite. We have about 70% IE users. So we were sort of faced with the point where I was like, well, do I want 75% of my users to get what I consider to be a horrible experience? And also, I kind of have a little bit of vindictiveness in that, the years of torture from IE, I thought I'd get them back, Maybe if a major, website / CMS / software, sort of relied on this functionality, it would incite the team to add it sooner or anything like that. So I eventually, smart people can rationalize anything, and dumb people can too. We did it. So we shipped it, and it looked totally the same. And this seems like a lot of talk for something as minor as rounded corners, if you're thinking that, and you are right. Because it turns out that there is literally no measurable difference in how anyone used it before or after, regardless of whether the corners were rounded or not. And I started to think about this and look at the biggest gains we've had in different parts of WordPress performance and front-end performance, and particularly on WordPress.com, where it's now 1,000-something servers, and so even small percentage gains in efficiency on that side can translate to, that's a couple dozen or 50 or 100 servers we don't need anymore, or that we have room to grow. And what I came to the conclusion of, that the times where we said no were the times when we decided not to do something was when we got the biggest increases in efficiency. When we were rewriting existing code, we were able to get incremental improvements. But when we just ripped the whole thing out, obviously you're not doing something. And also, I'm a big believer of this from a user interface point of view. One of my big jihads in the WordPress world is against options. Because often, as any of you involved with open source know, everyone kind of wants their 15 pixels of fame, right? And if ever there's an argument, something which mailing lists seem designed to create, long, protracted arguments where everyone's, quoting sentence by sentence what the other person says and responding to it. A typical way to resolve these, at some point, you're just being bludgeoned by all these mailing list posts. You're like, make it stop, make it stop. Instead of making it blue or green, well, I had an option to make it blue or green. Now, in addition to increasing complexity, in terms of testing for all the various combinations of options, I think the biggest burden here is actually the cognitive burden that it has on users. That why should they care whether the widget is blue or green? Why should they, particularly, this drives me most nuts on installation options. You haven't even started using whatever it is yet, and they're asking you questions about it. I don't know, I haven't installed the darn thing. The only thing worse is when you're installing something like Java and somehow you end up with the Yahoo toolbar. I have no idea how that happens. I've done it 3 times, and I am not a dumb computer user. I have no idea. But what underscores this is there's a need for speed. And why do we care so much? Why does it matter that we're obsessed with, getting these incremental improvements and, eking every last bit of performance out of things? When, as I've demonstrated through my parables, wow, what is that thing? I'm a little scared. Do you know what that is? That's what? No. Wow. Whew. Okay, that is an awesome Wi-Fi access point. I want that in my house. You'll put it on the wall. So the need for speed, why does it matter? As I've shown that sometimes we can have significant improvements. I mean, a several second improvement in a page load time that actually has no measurable input on how people are using it at all. And so sort of the moral foundation I've come to think about performance as, though, is that at scale, these things really matter. So for WordPress.com, let's say we do about 1 billion to user-facing front-end pages per month. Now let's say we could get half-second improvement out of those. So, call it 600,000 or 600 million seconds being saved every month. That translates into about 6,900 days, or about 19 years of people's lives around the world that you're saving. Now, of course, those are in half-second intervals. Intermits? Wow, that word totally lost me. It's in half-second chunks, so it doesn't really, people aren't really going to notice. But collectively, you're actually having a huge impact on the world. This is much akin to the same arguments people make about carbon emissions or, saving the environment. Is that, every time I don't turn off my light, it doesn't really matter to me. My bill has like a $1 difference at the end of the month. But collectively, across the world, we're heating the whole darn thing up. And it's starting to get dangerous. And so it's the same thing with people. All of us in the room, any of us who are building websites, are consuming massive amounts of time. And as technology grows and grows, time is the one thing that is finite, and ultimately the most important. It used to be the problem on the internet or in the world was that access to information was hard, right? You had to go and get an encyclopedia that took up 2 bookshelves or things like that. Now the problem is that we have way too much information. It's all about filters and ultimately saving time. And we have the ability, across this room, we could probably save, I just talked about saving 19 years per month, which is, a full-grown kid going to college per month, just on our site. And, we're not even, WordPress.com isn't getting people laid like Facebook or, these other sites. So think how much they could save. And ultimately, that's why this is important. That's why we should all buy both of Steve's books and read them like the Bible. This is why we should continue to be obsessed about these things and not be discouraged, even when they don't have a perceptible change in sort of the bottom line. It didn't change the funnel. It didn't do anything. Because my theory here is that when something is faster, we've all had the experience, right? Maybe it's something like Flow, maybe it's something, but when an interface is just really fast, you feel good. And I think ultimately what that comes down to is you feel in control, right? Like when something is just ultra responsive. I remember the first time I used Gmail, I was like, man, this just feels kind of good. I feel like, the web app isn't controlling me, I'm controlling it. And ultimately that feeling of control, I think, translates to happiness to everyone. So in order to increase the happiness of the world, we all have to keep working on this. Matt Mullenweg, that's my website, MITT, and if you love this stuff, you should apply for a job at Automattic. We're hiring. Thank you. So we have time for 2 questions, if there are any out there. All right. Hi, and green shirt. What's your name? Hi.
You guys all have, what was it, Turbo or something like that, using gears for WordPress?
You know why it was called that? Because remember the turbo buttons on like 386s? And you'd press it and it would go like vroom, and the game wouldn't be playable anymore. That's why we called it turbo. So we basically, that was a Google Gears feature, and we essentially use Google Gears in a very lazy way. We use it much akin to a local CDN, where all the files are being cached locally, so you don't have any latency or anything going to the server. And it does, if you turn it on, it feels really snappy. However, that has been one of the buggiest parts of WordPress, and I'm not really sure why. But we get these problems where someone upgrades and they come to us and they say, my WordPress is going crazy. It's like the Armageddon. Everything's everywhere. And inevitably what happens is that the CSS or JavaScript is broken. So you get a very degraded experience. When we dig in, it turns out that for whatever reason, their browser, regardless of what it was that was running Gears, didn't get the new manifest file or didn't update all the files correctly or something was corrupted along the way. So that does not work super good yet, but I'm really looking forward to that and all the improvements in HTML5 because I think it's going to really enable sort of a new mode of interaction, both for web apps and a new mode of performance. My ultimate dream is for whether you're offline or online for WordPress to work exactly the same. Now that's going to take us a couple of years to get there because we have to completely change how we interact with the database and everything like that. But ultimately, you should have a parity of experience between desktop applications and web applications. And as far as we've come with JavaScript engines, with browsers, with everything, it's not quite there yet. Any more questions? All right. Thank you very, very much.